All right, so tonight we are going to talk the ongoing story of the Noble Eightfold Path, right concentration. Um, so, very brief recap of just kind of an approach point here. There are 8 steps or 8 limbs. We are about to talk about the 8th of the 8. I think we spent 2 weeks on right view, which is the first one, and then we spent 1 week on right resolve, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. We did all of those in 1 week, and then I think we spent a week on effort and 2 weeks on mindfulness. So the point of recapping that is, a lot of the time when we talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, we spend a lot of time on action, speech, and livelihood. And the way we're talking about it here is much more the approach than the tactics. It's much more it's about view and mindfulness and concentration and effort. It's not about the details of what we say and what we do. It's about how we do it. So the same approach, I think, is going to apply here with concentration. I'm a big advocate when we talk about practice of understand what you're trying to do. It's not a set of rules we're trying to follow. It's most important to understand what this is about, what we're trying to accomplish with the practice, because we're all different, and then we figure out how the practice, which elements of the practice are then skillful for us. So right concentration, I am going to go back to here we go. It is no, it's this one here. It's Samyutta Nikaya 45.8, which is the one that just lists all the elements of the path and it kind of defines them. It's fairly short. And what is right concentration? It says at the end. There is the case where a monk quite secluded from sensuality. So actually, it says what is right effort, and it then talks about skillful and unskillful, arisen and unrisen. What is right mindfulness, ardent, alert and mindful, subduing greed and distress, body in the body, feelings in the feelings, and so forth. So it's the definitional thing. And then when it gets to right concentration, there is the case where a monk quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful dharmas, enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, etc., etc. With the stilling of directed thoughts, etc., enters and remains in the second jhana. It goes on third and fourth jhana. That's it. That's how it defines right concentration. This is the sutra I go back to time and again when I'm looking at definition and what the Pali Canon, how the Pali Canon defines the elements of the path, but it is consistent throughout. When you look up concentration, it is consistent. It talks about the jhanas. That's how it defines it. And so there's, jhanas, big word, it's a short word, but big topic, difficult topic, don't want to go there. So there's kind of this scary element about the jhanas. We're going to be talking about them in some detail this evening. So there are certainly some elements that can be intimidating, but broadly they should not be intimidating. And it's unfortunate that we've ended up in that place. They're just, as we practice, they're just something that naturally happens. It's just settling into deeper and more still meditation. That's all it is. And there are just little thresholds we cross as that happens. And these jhanas are ways of describing these thresholds. And they can also then, once you're familiar with them, be used as guides. Think of like learning to speak or paint or play the piano. You start off with basic elements, and then before you know it, you're doing difficult stuff. This thing that I'm doing right now, this speaking, using multiple tenses, complicated vocabulary, complicated linguistic structures, different case structures, it's all incredibly sophisticated, but it just happens. We're just immersed and we practice. We're in an environment where speaking happens, and it just happens. And the jhanas naturally unfold in our practice in much the same way. They are important because, well, they're important for a number of reasons, but a couple of reasons they're important. Reason one, where our practice takes us is to calming and to insight. Calming and insight. As we settle more, things become stiller, we can see more clearly. As we see more clearly, we penetrate, dissolve things, there becomes more space for it to settle more. And so there's this self-fulfilling, this virtuous cycle of greater levels of insight, therefore less levels of distraction and of getting caught up in the noise that we think is us and we think is our life, and getting just carried away with this word we like to use, attachment, right? So the jhanas are practices that help and allow that process. And they're pleasant. One of the elements of this path is, it's in the Zen tradition, you talk about using a peg to knock out a peg. And you're using a smaller peg to knock out a bigger peg. And that's kind of what we're doing here. They're pleasant. And as you experience the pleasures that are there in this meditation, they're just nicer and sweeter than the pleasures of another bowl of ice cream or watching a really exciting movie. They're just sweet and comfortable and pleasant. So becoming familiar with those more subtle pleasures and enjoying the subtle pleasures and allowing the more gross pleasures to fade away is a carrot that helps us move along the path. So to give just a little sense of what this is like, and this is going to be something that is going to be very familiar to most, if not all of you. I'm going to get us to do just a very quick breathing exercise together, and it's going to take us to where hopefully you just get a little sense of this, of a pleasant bodily sensation. So the active part of this is I'm going to get you to breathe in a couple of times, and then when you breathe out through pursed lips, comme ça. So there's a little bit of pressure, and there's a deep out breath from a very deep in breath. So just settle into a comfortable position and just take a couple of breaths to settle. Now take a nice deep in breath, really deep, all the way in. And breathe out through pursed lips. And as you breathe out, let your mind come down. As the breath goes out, your stomach will go in, and allow your mind to come all the way down to just below your navel. And keep breathing out and stay breathed out. Keep your attention deep and low. And now do that just one more time. So hopefully, so now come back. So hopefully that gave you just a little bit of a touch of a very pleasant bodily sensation. Silence. Is any nods to say that happened? Yeah. Yeah. So, and if you imagine working with that, you can actually keep on breathing more gently. And you can actually kind of blow on that, just gently nurture that, and you can cause that to spread, and that then becomes a pervasive, very pleasant bodily sensation. So this is just settling into this deep, settled absorption state with a very pleasant bodily sensation. Another sensation, I didn't realize this until shockingly recently, but when I was a kid, sunbathing, you go to the beach and it was Britain, right? So you'd wear t-shirts, it was usually windy, and we'd swim in this freezing water. But every now and again the sun would come out, But we didn't sunbathe because that was silly. But I've realized recently why people do it, because it's this same very gentle, pleasant bodily sensation. It's just this warm bodily feeling. And as you get settled in your practice, and I know at least a couple of you experience this as I do, there are times when I just don't want to talk. There are times when just driving in quiet is just so much nicer than turning the radio on or talking. And it's that same, it's just a very subtle pleasure. And it's a stable, settled place. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about the jhanas. They're very different. There's a lot. What I'm about to read, it's very stepwise, but there is a fairly predictable pattern here that is repeated, but it is different. Some people will skip steps. Some people have other steps in there. Some people experience these things in different ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the jhanas and just talk about the jhanas and what they're doing and how and what it all means. So, there is the case where a monk, a disciple of the noble ones, making it his object to let go, attains concentration, attains singleness of mind. Singleness of mind is a translation of ekagata. That's the Pali word. Ekagata is usually translated as one-pointed mind, single-pointed mind. I think that's an unfortunate translation because it does not mean we've got our mind focused on the tip of this pen. It means, like when we're in the abodes of mindfulness, mindful of the body in the body. The body is a place where we put our concentration. That is a single location. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the word that's used, and there's a lot of parallels between the Yoga Sutras and the Noble Eightfold Path and so forth. The word that's used there is ekatatra. Not ekagata, ekatatra. And it's really doing the same thing, and it means single object, which I think is much more what this is pointing at. So it's focused. It's not laser focused on a point, but it is focused on a theme or an object or a space, and just really excluding extraneous noise. That's really what it's about. Attain singleness of mind, quite secluded from sensuality, so subduing desire for sense pleasures, secluded from unskillful dharmas. We talked about skillful and unskillful, so it's avoiding stuff that's going to be unhelpful and being mindful of what's skillful and what's not. Enters and remains in the first jhana. Rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So we're secluded, secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful dharmas. Rapture, the word is piti, and this varies widely. I had some very, when I realized looking back on it a decade later, this is what it was, but it was very intense sexual arousal kind of experience. That's how I experienced it, and that edge still shows up again. It shows up from time to time, after initially sort of wondering what on earth was going on, I just realized it was unhelpful, and I just bypassed it. So I've now just completely bypassed piti. Some people will experience it almost like a kundalini rush. For some people it's very low key. For other people it can be completely overwhelming, and it can take days to come down from this. So it's to me that's one of the most unpredictable pieces of this whole thing, is what this joy, what this rapture actually shows up looking like. Yeah. Rapture and pleasure. The pleasure is much more what we just did. The pleasure is much more gentle. Accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Vitaka and vikara are the Pali or the Sanskrit words. And they are usually translated here. They're usually shot together in the Buddhist canon. So they generally conflate. They're not separate words. They generally conflate. And they're generally translated as things like directed thought, which is You've got an object of concentration, and your mind, you're actively thinking about it. There's stuff going on up here that is about that. And then there's evaluation of it. Now, if we go to the Yoga Sutra, the same words show up there. And of course, the Yoga Sutra is a completely different tradition, so I don't want to overly equate the two. But they both grew up out of the same historical background in 3,000, 2,500 years ago in India. So there's a real commonality in practice, and I think we can look back at the original intent of some of these words by comparing the two. So in the Yoga Sutras, Vitakka has a gross feeling. It's really more active and more engaged, more in line with Piti, now I think about it. And Vikara is much more subtle. Vikara is it's more like Vitakka is body and Vikara is mind. So there's a grossness and a subtleness flavor in these two words as well. Anyway, but we've got the voices are going. That's the point here. The voices are going. In the first jhana, the voices are going, and we've got this pleasure and this joy. We continue. With the stilling of directed thoughts and evaluation, enters and remains in the second jhana, rapture and pleasure born of concentration. Not born of seclusion, born of concentration. So what that's saying is, we've still got rapture and pleasure, and they're arising from our practice, and in this case the practice is more settled concentration. Concentration is becoming stronger, so we don't need to talk about seclusion anymore, because the seclusion, the level of concentration is sufficient that it already has implicit within it seclusion. So we don't need to talk about seclusion as a separate starting point. So we've still got this joy and pleasure, and as that concentration intensifies, the voices just stop, and they really do. As you settle in, this is probably not unfamiliar to you, but you may not have noticed it in these terms. There is a place where, as you're settling in, the voices just stop. And there's a scene in the movie The Lord of the Rings where Gollum is talking to himself, and he's wondering about there's the Gollum who's addicted to the ring, and there's the Gollum who's Schmeagol and wants to help. And at some point, gone! He's gone! Schmeagol, he's gone! And it's just the voices stop. And then they come back, but they just stop. So there's that. That's entering the second jhana. With the fading of rapture. So again, it's just a natural progression here. It's just a natural progression. We can help it. We can help manage it. We can find points that we can water and cultivate. We can find points that we can kind of nudge aside, bringing skillful practices to bear and noticing what's skillful and what's not skillful in the experience of jhana. But with the fading of rapture, he remains equanimous. That's the first time this word has showed up in the description of the jhanas. Equanimous. Equanimous is really, here it's got a flavour of non-judgmental, just accepting of where we are. So he remains equanimous, mindful and alert, and senses pleasure in the body. So we're still present, we're still alert, and there's pleasure here. It's this pleasure we were just talking about. Remains and enters in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, he has a pleasant abiding. So I'm going to skip here. It seems appropriate to skip to a different place because there is an idea here of unskillful concentration states. And unskillful concentration states aren't really talked about in much detail, but the ones that seem to come out to me are deluded concentration is what Thanissaro calls one of these. Deluded concentration is when we overly settle on one of the subtle pleasure, and we kind of lose our objectivity, we lose the flavor of mindfulness, we lose the background awareness, and we just get hooked on this subtle pleasure, and it starts to become a little bit fuzzy and blurry, so that when we come out of meditation, it's not really clear what we were focusing on, what we were concentrating on. We've got this recollection of a very pleasant experience, but it was just a pleasant experience. It's just like sunbathing. There was nothing happening. So here, as it talks about the third jhana, equanimous and mindful. Equanimous, not getting hooked on it. Mindful, paying attention, noticing. Has a pleasant abiding. There's another one, and this just shows up. This is one that I went through periods where this would happen a lot, and it still happens occasionally. I just black out. And I'm not asleep. There's something there. There's a little something there, so that when I come to, I know I've been sitting here. I know I haven't been asleep. But it's a state of complete non-perception. So there's a settledness, and then somehow or other, that awareness just turns off. So there's not much I can do with that. I just notice it and try and keep awareness there, but sometimes it just happens. And then one that's more easy to spot, we can slip back, we can let our concentration take us back in more concentrated states. Concentration intensifies anything, so we can start letting our mind shift back more to sort of sensual pleasures and kid ourselves that we're working on sensual pleasures when we're really just hooked on a sensual pleasure, some form of desire or self-gratification or whatever. So I bring those up now because in this third jhana it specifically talks about equanimous and mindful. He has a pleasant abiding. Got to remember equanimous and mindful. Then we go on with abandoning of pleasure and pain. As with the earlier disappearance of joy and distress, he enters and remains in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness. Purity of equanimity and mindfulness. So physiological experience here that I've had is, as I settle deeper, my body naturally tries to curl forward. There really is a physical sinking that's going on here. You can experience a physical settling. And so there's still a body, but it is equanimous beyond pleasure and pain. Your legs, there's pins and needles, but you don't really notice. It's just not very interesting. But there's still mindfulness, there's still attention to what's going on. So this is just settling in. I'm going to go through those again, this time with, he's got a couple of different sets of similes for these. And the set of similes that I find most interesting and helpful is a set of water-based similes. So the first jhana, and if you're interested in it, you wanted to look it up, the particular place I'm looking for this is Majjhima Nikaya 119. You can find it in there. And it begins breathing in long, breathing out long, and all that. So the first jhana, is likened to getting a ball of soap, getting all the soap granules and water, and kneading the soap and the water together. So there's something very active about this, something very physical about this, something very engaged about this. The water is reflecting the pleasure. So you've got, and the kneading, I think, is more the rapture. But in the first three of these, there's water involved. The water is clearly representing the pleasure. And you just think about having a bath. Suspension of sensory inputs. People pay a lot of money to go lie in a sensory deprivation bath, which is basically a bath, you know. So kneading the soap. This is giving a metaphor or a simile for what that jhana is like. You're working it and you're working it, and it comes into this nice smooth ball, smooth consistency, but there's this work, there's this effort, there's something very physical and tangible about it. And the physical and tangible stuff is also, I think, pointing to the voices, the stuff going on in the head. The second jhana is a lake in a valley, cool lake in a valley, no rivers in, no rivers out, but there is a spring feeding it from underground and rain coming in from on top. So you've got this very lovely, pleasant thing that has this motion from above and below, and the motion is the joy and the water is the pleasure. The third one is a lily in a pond, and the lily, not the lily, a lotus. The lotus doesn't make it to the surface, so the lotus is in the middle and it's flowering in the middle, and the lotus is held in the embrace of this cool, still water. And the fourth one I find a little less interesting, but the fourth one is covered from head to foot with a white cloth, so there would be no part of his body to which the white cloth did not extend. But I find I don't find that one as useful, you may, but I find the first three really useful ways of looking at the physiological experience of the jhanas. So we did something at the beginning where I did this little breathing thing. In a couple of different places in the sutras, but it's talking about the four abodes of mindfulness, the four foundations of mindfulness, and those are set up as ways to enter the jhanas. So that actually you can read the Satipatthana as setting that up. We're really focused on the body in the body, and as we really settle into the body in the body, we're settling deeper and deeper into concentration. And the Anapanasati Sutta, which is the 16 the 4 tetrads, the 16 steps. The first 4 are described as the body and then the feelings and and so forth. And it seems pretty clear to me that, the second one we're talking about piti and sukha, rapture and pleasure. And then noticing the mind and calming the mind, or the fabrications of mind. It's not expressly saying this is how you enter the first jhana, but there is very much a trajectory of moving through the jhanas that's woven into the Anapanasati, and at the same time the Anapanasati is very clearly structured around mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of body in body, feelings in feelings. So the foundations of mindfulness are just a very natural way of entering the jhanas. And again, it's a very natural thing. If you settle, if you really in a good place working on mindfulness of the body in the body, you will settle into it, and this kind of pleasure would just start to happen. It would just start to happen, and then it just gets deeper. Another place that shows up to enter it is the Brahma Viharas, and the Brahma Viharas are goodwill or loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, right? And there's a number of places where it shows up talking about concentration practice of the Brahma Viharas, projecting it near, far, and all around. Right? I don't have the words in front of me, but that's a flavor that shows up a lot. That is a description of a concentration practice using the Brahma Viharas. And there are other places I think I made a note of one here, page 237. Let's see what that does. You should train yourself thus. Goodwill, or metta, as my awareness release, will be developed, pursued, and given a means of transport, etc. That's how you should train yourself. So we're using goodwill to train ourselves in concentration. When concentration is thus developed, thus well developed by you, you should then train yourself. Compassion is my awareness release. So this is intentionally setting up the Brahma Viharas as gateways into concentration, gateways into the jhanas. There's another one. So actually, I'm going to go a little bit ahead because I want to pause and talk, and we've got at least another week of concentration. But I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself here in order to come back and make another point. Getting ahead of myself. What we just talked through is the four form jhanas. There are then four formless jhanas. And I used to read these and think, oh, this is just words, it's just gibberish. I mean, clearly there's stuff that goes on beyond equanimity, but these are just words. They're not. It's the same. There is a really clear trajectory. So the first one is boundless space. In very simple terms, when you're sitting in that very settled body in the fourth jhana, you can start to notice the spaces. You can start to notice that this fabricated body is not absolutely uniform. There are gaps, there are spaces. And so you start noticing the spaces rather than the body, the spaces in between, and put your attention on the spaces and notice there's no boundary. And you don't have to go to the edge to find there's no boundary. You notice there's no boundary, and you move your awareness into the space, and you're moving into boundless space. And the next one is boundless consciousness. Who's noticing this? What's noticing this? There is consciousness that is simply associated with the space. That's what you have moved into. So that too then is boundless. Boundless consciousness. And as we're moving through this trajectory, that's far enough for now, but as we're moving through this trajectory, we start to, there becomes kind of a separation, and it's a separation that has really interesting philosophical and soteriological implications for people talking about this, because you start to notice that the awareness is discrete from this. So it's like, oh my goodness, that's a God. You know, you can see how this kind of separation we notice can be experienced in the Yoga Sutras as Ishvara. I'm not saying that's what it is, but to say non-dual is to kind of miss a point, because it's like my rather cynical comment about postmodernism. There is no absolute truth. That's a performative contradiction, because what I've just said asserts to be a truth, but there are no truths. In the same way, you can't talk about non-dualism, because to talk about non-dualism puts it in opposition to something else, which is essentially a dualistic way of thinking. So non-dualism, as we experience it, is this, it's the questions that Buddha wouldn't answer. It's the questions that Buddha wouldn't answer, which included, where does a Buddha go after he dies? Does he exist? Does he not exist? And so forth. So that comes back, ways to enter the jhana. Classically, one of the ways that most faith traditions, probably every faith tradition except Buddhism, classically one of the ways that is found to enter deep concentration states is submission to God. Surrender to God. Which is, in our tradition, it's this consciousness that does not land, which is what the Buddha talks about in the Pali Canon. It's the mind not dwelling anywhere in the Diamond Sutra. It's Buddha nature, the Dharmakaya. It's there, very clearly there in the Pure Land tradition with Amitabha Buddha. And it's there in the Lotus Sutra tradition with Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Just, that's it. That's the practice. So, this is not to suggest we should all create a Buddhist God. And it's actually there in the the Pali Canon as well, because we are encouraged in different places to hold up the Buddha as an object for concentration, which is not the Buddha as a divinity, but as somebody, as an object for concentration, to help us in our practice. So it's something to play with, something to be aware of. That is a well-recognized, and this I think is why God shows up in so many spiritual traditions, because it is probably historically most people have found that the easiest way to settle into these deep experiences. All right.